Alternatively, suicides that in other times would have evoked the question, why do you suppose he did it? Now had the motive assigned automatically. The poor fellow was caught in the crash. Finally, it must be noted that, although suicides did not increase sharply, either in the months of the crash or in 1929 as a whole, the rate did rise in the later Depression years. In memory, some of these tragedies may have been moved back a year or two to the time of the stock market crash. The weight of the evidence suggests that the newspapers and the public merely seized on such suicides as occurred to show that people were reacting appropriately to their misfortune. Enough deaths could be related in one way or another to the market to serve. Beginning soon after Black Thursday, stories of violent self-destruction began to appear in the papers with some regularity. Curiously, though another myth runs strongly to the contrary, few people in these days followed the classical method of jumping from a high window. One would-be suicide jumped into the Schuylkill River, although he changed his mind when he hit the water and was fished out. The head of the Rochester Gas and Electric Company took gas. Another martyr dipped himself in gasoline and touched himself off. He not only made good his escape from his margin calls, but took his wife with him. There was also the suicide of J.J. Reardon. Reardon's death made large headlines in the newspapers on Sunday, November 10th. The papers obviously had sensed a story not only in his death itself, but also in the manner of its announcement. Reardon was a widely known and popular figure among New York Democrats. He had been treasurer of one of Mayor Walker's campaigns, and also of one of Al Smith's. He and Smith were close friends and business associates. Al Smith was a member of the board of directors of the recently organized County Trust Company, of which Reardon was the president. On Friday, November 8th, Reardon went to his bank, took a pistol from a teller's cage, went home, and shot himself. Al Smith was notified, and his sorrow over the death of his friend was not diminished by the knowledge that the news might start a serious run on their bank. A medical examiner was called, but further notification was withheld until the following day, Saturday, at noon, when the bank had closed for the weekend. There had been a long wake through which the distinguished mourners had kept one eye on the corpse and the other on the clock. The medical examiner first implied that he had postponed notification out of a feeling of deep responsibility for depositors of the county trust. This was a formidable exercise of discretion. Carried to its logical conclusion, it meant that all deaths would have to be weighed by the attending doctor for their financial consequences. Later, it was tacitly conceded that the decision was Al Smith's. So great was Smith's prestige, and also the general nervousness, that the action was not questioned. For some days, rumors had been circulating that Reardon had been wiped out by the crash. Now his friends rallied to his defense, some with vehement assertions that he never played the market. He had been deeply involved, as subsequent Senate committee investigations of the stock market revealed, but a hurried audit of the bank showed that all of its funds were intact. This fact was well publicized over the weekend. The city administration boldly announced that it was leaving its deposits with the bank, which was a trifle like saying that it would remain on speaking terms with Tammany Hall. Raskob temporarily assumed the chairmanship. No run developed. The church concluded that Reardon, a Catholic, had been temporarily deranged and thus was eligible for burial in consecrated ground. Among the honorary pallbearers were Al Smith, Herbert Lehman, and John J. Raskob. And among those attending the funeral were Mayor Frank Hague, Vincent Astor, Grover Whalen, James A. Farley, and M.J. Meehan, the market operator. 2.5 years later, on Saturday, March 12, 1932, Ivar Kruger shot himself dead in his Paris apartment at 11 o'clock in the morning local time. This was 6 hours before the New York Stock Exchange closed. With the cooperation of the Paris police, the news was withheld until the market closed. Later, a congressional committee was exceedingly critical of this delay, and Al Smith's action was cited in the defense. In the case of Kruger, it should be added, the security system of the Paris police was less than perfect. It is fairly certain that there was heavy selling that morning, including heavy short selling, of Kruger and Toll by Continental interests. 2. In many ways, the effect of the crash on embezzlement was more significant than on suicide. To the economist, embezzlement is the most interesting of crimes. Alone, among the various forms of larceny, it has a time parameter. Weeks, months, or years may elapse between the commission of the crime and its discovery. This is a period, incidentally, when the embezzler has his gain and the man who has been embezzled, oddly enough, feels no loss. There is a net increase in psychic wealth. At any given time, there exists an inventory of undiscovered embezzlement in, or more precisely not in, the country's businesses and banks. This inventory, it should perhaps be called the bezel, amounts at any moment to many millions of dollars. It also varies in size with the business cycle. In good times, people are relaxed, trusting, and money is plentiful. But even though money is plentiful, there are always many people who need more. Under these circumstances, the rate of embezzlement grows, the rate of discovery falls off, and the bezel increases rapidly. In depression, all this is reversed. Money is watched with a narrow, suspicious eye. The man who handles it is assumed to be dishonest until he proves himself otherwise. Audits are penetrating and meticulous. Commercial morality is enormously improved. The bezel shrinks. The stock market boom and the ensuing crash caused a traumatic exaggeration of these normal relationships. To the normal needs for money, for home, family, and dissipation was added during the boom the new and overwhelming requirement for funds to play the market or to meet margin calls. Money was exceptionally plentiful. People were also exceptionally trusting. A bank president who was himself trusting Kruger, Hobson, and Insull was obviously unlikely to suspect his lifelong friend, the cashier. In the late 20s, the bezel grew apace. Just as the boom accelerated the rate of growth, so the crash enormously advanced the rate of discovery. Within a few days, something close to universal trust turned into something akin to universal suspicion. Audits were ordered. Strained or preoccupied behavior was noticed. Most importantly, the collapse in stock values made irredeemable the position of the employee who had embezzled to play the market. He now confessed. After the first week or so of the crash, reports of defaulting employees were a daily occurrence. They were far more common than the suicides. On some days, comparatively brief accounts occupied a column or more in the Times. The amounts were large and small, and they were reported from far and wide. The most spectacular embezzlement of the period, the counterpart of the Reardon suicide, was the looting of the Union Industrial Bank of Flint, Michigan. The gross take, estimates of which grew alarmingly as the investigation proceeded, was stated in the Literary Digest later in the year to be $3,592,000. In the beginning, this embezzlement was a matter of individual initiative. Unknown to each other, a number of the bank's officers began making away with funds. Gradually, they became aware of each other's activities, and since they could scarcely expose each other, they cooperated. The enterprise eventually embraced about a dozen people, including virtually all of the principal officers of the bank. Operations were so well organized that even the arrival of bank examiners at the local hotels was made known promptly to members of the syndicate. Most of the funds which were purloined had been deposited with the bank to be loaned in the New York call market. The money was duly dispatched to New York, but promptly recalled while the records continued to show that it was there. The money was then returned once more to New York and put into stocks. In the spring of 1929, the group was about $100,000 ahead. Then, unfortunately, it went short just as the market soared into the blue yonder of the summer sky. This was so costly that the group was induced to return to a long position, which it did just before the crash. The crash, needless to say, was mortal. Each week during the autumn, more such unfortunates were revealed in their misery. Most of them were small men who had taken a flyer in the market and then become more deeply involved. Later, they had more impressive companions. It was the crash and the subsequent ruthless contraction of values which, in the end, exposed the speculation by Kruger, Hobson, and Insull with the money of other people. Should the American economy ever achieve permanent full employment and prosperity, firms should look well to their auditors. One of the uses of depression is the exposure of what auditors fail to find. Bagehot once observed, "Every great crisis reveals the excessive speculations of many houses which no one before suspected." 3. In mid-November 1929, at long last, the market stopped falling, at least for a while. The low was on Wednesday, November 13th. On that day, the Times Industrials closed at 224, down from 452, or by almost exactly one-half since September 3rd. They were also by then down 82 points, about one-quarter, from the close on that day barely 2 weeks before, when John D. Rockefeller had announced that he and his son were buying common stocks. On November 13th, there was another Rockefeller story. It was said that the family had entered a 1 million-share buying order to peg Standard Oil of New Jersey at 50. During the rest of November and December, the course of the market was moderately up. The decline had run its course. However, the end coincided with one last effort at reassurance. No one can say for sure that it did no good. One part was the announcement by the New York Stock Exchange of an investigation of short selling. Inevitably, in the preceding weeks, there had been rumors of bear raids on the market and of fortunes being made by the shorts. The benign people known as "they," who once had put the market up, were now a malign influence putting it down and making money out of the common disaster. In the early days of the crash, it was widely believed that Jesse L. Livermore, a Bostonian with a large and unquestionably exaggerated reputation for bear operations, was heading a syndicate that was driving the market down. So persistent did these rumors become that Livermore, whom few had thought sensitive to public opinion, issued a formal denial that he was involved in any deflationary plot. "What little business I have done in the stock market," he said, "has always been as an individual and will continue to be done on such basis." As early as October 24th, the Wall Street Journal, then somewhat less reserved in its view of the world than now, complained that there has been a lot of short selling, a lot of forced selling, and a lot of selling to make the market look bad. Such suspicions the exchange authorities now sought to dispel. Nothing came of the study. A more important effort at reassurance was made by President Hoover. Presumably, he was still indifferent to the fate of the stock market. But he could not be indifferent to the much publicized fundamentals, which by now were behaving worse each week. Prices of commodities were falling. Freight car loadings, pig iron and steel production, coal output, and automobile production were also all going down. So, as a result, was the general index of industrial production. Indeed, it was falling much more rapidly than in the sharp post-war depression of 1920 to 1921. There were alarming stories of the drop in consumer buying, especially of more expensive goods. It was said that sales of radio sets in New York had fallen by half since the crash. Mr. Hoover's first step was out of the later works of John Maynard Keynes. Precisely as Keynes and Keynesians would have advised, he announced a cut in taxes. The rate on both individuals and corporations was cut by 1 full percentage point. This reduced the income tax of a head of a family with no dependents and an income of $4,000 by 2/3. The man with $5,000 got a similar reduction. The tax of a married man with no dependents and an income of $10,000 was cut in half. These were dramatic reductions, but their effect was sadly mitigated by the fact that for most people the taxes being cut were already insignificant. The man with $4,000 had his annual tax burden reduced from $5.63 to $1.88. The man with $5,000 got a cut from $16.88 to $5.63. For the man with $10,000, the reduction in annual tax was from $120 to $65. The step, nonetheless, was well received as a contribution to increased purchasing power, expanded business investment, and a general revival of confidence. Mr. Hoover also called a series of meetings on the state of the economy. The leading industrialists, the leading railway executives, the heads of the large utilities, the heads of the important construction companies, the union leaders, and the heads of the farm organizations met in turn with the president during the latter part of November. The procedure in the case of each of the meetings was the same. There was a solemn session with the president. Those attending had their picture taken with the president, and there was a press interview at which the conferees gave the press their opinion on the business prospect. The latter, without exception, was highly favorable. After the meeting of the industrial leaders on November 21st, which was attended by, among others, Henry Ford, Walter Teagle, Owen D. Young, Alfred P. Sloan, Jr., Pierre DuPont, Walter Gifford, and Andrew Mellon, the expressions of confidence were so robust that Julius Rosenwald, who also attended, said he feared there might soon be a bad labor shortage. The utility, rail, and construction executives were equally hopeful. Even the heads of the farm organizations were less misanthropic than normal for that time. They said afterward that they had told the president that the morale of their industry was better than it had been for years. This was organized reassurance on a really grand scale, and it attracted some of the most enthusiastic comment of the period. A Wall Street financial writer began his story of the sessions, "Order up the Moors," was Marshal Foch's reply at the First Battle of the Marne. "Order up the business reserves," directed President Hoover as pessimistic reports flowed in from all quarters following the stock market crash. The Philadelphia Record was led to describe the president as easily the most commanding figure in the modern science of engineering statesmanship. The Boston Globe said that the nation is now aware that it has at the White House a man who believes not in the philosophy of drift, but in the dynamics of mastery. 4. Yet to suppose that President Hoover was engaged only in organizing further reassurance is to do him a serious injustice. He was also conducting one of the oldest, most important, and unhappily, one of the least understood, rights in American life. This is the right of the meeting which is called not to do business, but to do no business. It is a right which is still much practiced in our time. It is worth examining for a moment. Men meet together for many reasons in the course of business. They need to instruct or persuade each other. They must agree on a course of action. They find thinking in public more productive or less painful than thinking in private. But there are at least as many reasons for meetings to transact no business. Meetings are held because men seek companionship, or, at a minimum, wish to escape the tedium of solitary duties. They yearn for the prestige which accrues to the man who presides over meetings, and this leads them to convoke assemblages over which they can preside. Finally, there is the meeting which is called not because there is business to be done, but because it is necessary to create the impression that business is being done. Such meetings are more than a substitute for action. They are widely regarded as action. The fact that no business is transacted at a no business meeting is normally not a serious cause of embarrassment to those attending. Numerous formulas have been devised to prevent discomfort. Thus, scholars, who are great devotees of the no business meeting, rely heavily on the exchange of ideas justification. To them, the exchange of ideas is an absolute good. Any meeting at which ideas are exchanged is, therefore, useful. This justification is nearly ironclad. It is very hard to have a meeting of which it can be said that no ideas were exchanged. Salesmen and sales executives, who also are important practitioners of the no business gathering, commonly have a different justification, and one that has strong spiritual overtones. Out of the warmth of comradeship, the interplay of personality, the stimulation of alcohol, and the inspiration of oratory, comes an impulsive rededication to the daily task. The meeting pays for itself in a fuller and better life and the sale of more goods in future weeks and months. The no business meetings of the great business executives depend for their illusion of importance on something quite different. Not the exchange of ideas or the spiritual rewards of comradeship, but a solemn sense of assembled power gives significance to this assemblage. Even though nothing of importance is said or done, men of importance cannot meet without the occasion seeming important. Even the commonplace observation of the head of a large corporation is still the statement of the head of a large corporation. What it lacks in content, it gains in power from the assets back of it. The no business meeting was an almost perfect instrument for the situation in which President Hoover found himself in the autumn of 1929. The modest tax cut apart, the president was clearly averse to any large-scale government action to counter the developing depression. Nor was it very certain at the time what could be done. Yet by 1929, popular faith in laissez-faire had been greatly weakened. No responsible political leader could safely proclaim a policy of keeping hands off. The no business meetings at the White House were a practical expression of laissez-faire. No positive action resulted. At the same time, they gave a sense of truly impressive action. The conventions governing the no business session ensured that there would be no embarrassment arising from the absence of business. Those who attended accepted as a measure of the importance of the meetings the importance of the people attending. The newspapers also cooperated in emphasizing the importance of the sessions. Had they done otherwise, they would, of course, have undermined the value of the sessions as news. In recent times, the no business meeting at the White House, attended by governors, industrialists, representatives of business, labor, and agriculture, has become an established institution of government. Some device for simulating action, when action is impossible, is indispensable in a sound and functioning democracy. Mr. Hoover in 1929 was a pioneer in this field of public administration. As the Depression deepened, it was said that Mr. Hoover's meetings had been a failure. This, obviously, reflects a very narrow view. 5. In January, February, and March of 1930, the stock market showed a substantial recovery. Then in April, the recovery lost momentum, and in June there was another large drop. Thereafter, with few exceptions, the market dropped week by week, month by month, and year by year through June of 1932. The position when it finally halted made the worst level during the crash seem memorable by contrast. On November 13, 1929, it may be recalled, the Times Industrials closed at 224. On July 8, 1932, they were 58. This value was not much more than the net by which they dropped on the single day of October 28, 1929. Standard Oil of New Jersey, which the Rockefellers were believed to have pegged at 50 on November 13, 1929, dropped below 20 in April 1932. On July 8th, it was 24. U.S. Steel on July 8th reached a low of 22. On September 3, 1929, it had sold as high as 262. General Motors was a bargain at 8 on July 8th, down from 73 on September 3, 1929. Montgomery Ward was 4, down from 138. Tel was 72, and on September 3, 1929, it had sold at 304. Anaconda sold at 4 on July 8th. The Commercial and Financial Chronicle observed that the copper shares are so low that their fluctuations are of little consequence. However, comparatively speaking, values in these staple stocks had been well maintained. Things were far worse with the investment trusts. Blue Ridge during the week ending July 8, 1932, was 63 cents, and Shenandoah was 50 cents. United Founders and American Founders were both around 50 cents as compared with 70 and 117 dollars, needless to say, on September 3, 1929. The fears of November 1929 that the investment trust might go to nothing had been largely realized. No one any longer suggested that business was sound, fundamentally or otherwise. During the week of July 8, 1932, Iron Age announced that steel operations had reached 12% of capacity. This was thought of its sort to be a record. Pig iron output was the lowest since 1896. A total of 720,278 shares were traded that day on the New York Stock Exchange. Before all this came to pass, there had been many more efforts at reassurance. In the weeks of the crash, President Hoover had sagely observed, "My own experience has been that words are not of any great importance in times of economic disturbance." This impregnable rule he thereafter forgot. In December, he told the Congress that the steps he had taken, the White House no business conferences in particular, had re-established confidence. In March 1930, following a flood of optimistic forecasts by his subordinates, Mr. Hoover said that the worst effect of the crash upon unemployment would be ended in 60 days. In May, Mr. Hoover said he was convinced, "We have now passed the worst, and with continued unity of effort, shall rapidly recover." Toward the end of the month, he said that business would be normal by fall. What was perhaps the last word on the policy of reassurance was said by Simeon D. Fess, the chairman of the Republican National Committee. Persons high in Republican circles are beginning to believe that there is some concerted effort on foot to utilize the stock market as a method of discrediting the administration. Every time an administration official gives out an optimistic statement about business conditions, the market immediately drops. Chapter 8. Aftermath 2. The crash blighted the fortunes of many hundreds of thousands of Americans. But among people of prominence, worse havoc was worked on reputations. In such circles, credit for wisdom, foresight, and, unhappily also, for common honesty, underwent a convulsive shrinkage. On the whole, those who had proclaimed during the crash that business was fundamentally sound were not held accountable for their words. The ritualistic nature of their expression was recognized. Then, as now, no one supposed that such spokesmen knew whether business was sound or unsound. One exception was Mr. Hoover. He undoubtedly suffered as the result of his repeated predictions of imminent prosperity. However, Hoover had converted the simple business ritual of reassurance into a major instrument of public policy. It was certain, in consequence, to be the subject of political comment. The scholarly forecasters were not so fortunate. People on the whole cherished the discovery that they were not omniscient. Mr. Lawrence disappeared from Princeton. Among economists, his voice was not heard again. The Harvard Economic Society, it will be recalled, had come up to the summer of the crash with a valuable reputation for pessimism. This position it abandoned during the summer when the stock market kept on rising and business seemed strong. On November 2nd, after the crash, the Society concluded that the present recession, both for stocks and business, is not the precursor of business depression. On November 10th, it made its notable estimate that a serious depression, like that of 1920 to 1921, is outside the range of probability. It repeated this judgment on November 23rd, and on December 21st gave its forecast for the new year. A depression seems improbable. We expect recovery of business next spring, with further improvement in the fall. On January 18, 1930, the Society said, "There are indications that the severest phase of the recession is over." On March 1st, that manufacturing activity is now, to judge from past periods of contraction, definitely on the road to recovery. On March 22nd, the outlook continues favorable. On March 29th, that the outlook is favorable. On April 19th, that by May or June, the spring recovery forecast in our letters of last December and November should be clearly apparent. On May 17th, that business will turn for the better this month or next, recover vigorously in the third quarter, and end the year at levels substantially above normal. On May 24th, it was suggested that conditions continue to justify the forecasts of May 17th. On June 21st, that, despite existing irregularities, there would soon be improvement. On June 28th, it stated that irregular and conflicting movements of business should soon give way to sustained recovery. On July 19th, it pointed out that untoward elements have operated to delay recovery, but the evidence nonetheless points to substantial improvement. And on August 30th, 1930, the Society stated that the present depression has about spent its force. Thereafter, the Society became less hopeful. On November 15, 1930, it said, "We are now near the end of the declining phase of the Depression." A year later, on October 31, 1931, it said, "Stabilization at present Depression levels is clearly possible." Even these last forecasts were wildly optimistic. Somewhat later, its reputation for infallibility rather dimmed, the Society was dissolved. Harvard economics professors ceased forecasting the future and again donned their accustomed garb of humility. Professor Irving Fisher tried hard to explain why he had been wrong. Early in November 1929, he suggested that the whole thing had been irrational and hence beyond prediction. In a statement that was not a model of coherence, he said, "It was the psychology of panic. It was mob psychology, and it was not, primarily, that the price level of the market was unsoundly high. The fall in the market was very largely due to the psychology by which it went down because it went down." The explanation attracted little attention, except from the editor of the Commercial and Financial Chronicle. The latter observed with succinct brutality, "The learned professor is wrong, as he usually is when he talks about the stock market." The mob, he added, didn't sell, it got sold out. Before the year was over, Professor Fisher tried again in a book, The Stock Market Crash and After. He argued, and rightly for the moment, that stocks were still on a plateau, albeit a somewhat lower one than before, that the crash was a great accident, that the market had gone up principally because of sound, justified expectations of earnings. He also argued that prohibition was still a strong force for higher business productivity and profits, and concluded that for the immediate future, at least, the outlook is bright. The book attracted little attention. One trouble with being wrong is that it robs the prophet of his audience when he most needs it to explain why. Out in Ohio, Professor Dice, he of the parasangs, survived honorably to write and teach for a lifetime about finance. This may be the place also to record another happy ending. Goldman Sachs & Company rescued its firm name from its delinquent offspring and returned to an earlier role of strict rectitude and stern conservatism. It became known for its business in the most austere of securities. 2. New York's two greatest banks, the Chase and the National City, suffered severely in the aftermath. They, of course, shared the general obloquy of the New York bankers, which resulted from the great hopes and great disappointments of organized support. But it was also the remarkable misfortune of each that it had as its head in those days a market operator in the grand manner. Of the two, the Chase was the more fortunate. Albert H. Wiggin, variously president, chairman of the board, and chairman of the governing board of the Chase, was a speculator and operator, but not an articulate one. However, in 1929 and the years preceding, he had been engaging in some astonishing enterprises. In 1929, he received $275,000 compensation as head of the Chase. He was also, or while head of the Chase had been, director of some 59 utility, industrial, insurance, and other corporations, and from some of these had also received a handsome salary. Armour & Company had paid him $40,000 to be a member of its finance committee. He got $20,000 a year from the Brooklyn Manhattan Transit Corporation. At least 7 other firms paid him from $2,000 to $5,000 annually. Wisdom and esteem, or even affection, were not the only factors in this compensation. Those who paid were usually clients and prospective borrowers from the Chase. But the most remarkable of Mr. Wiggins' extracurricular interests was a bevy of private companies. 3 were personal holding companies, 2 of which were named sentimentally for his daughters. 3 others were incorporated in Canada for highly unsentimental reasons of taxation and corporate reticence. These companies were the instruments for an astonishing variety of stock market operations. In one operation in the spring of 1929, Shermar Corporation, one of the namesake companies, participated with Harry F. Sinclair and Arthur W. Cutton in a mammoth pool in the common stock of Sinclair Consolidated Oil Company. Even in those tolerant days, Sinclair and Cutton were considered rather garish companions for a prominent banker. However, the operation netted Shermar $891,600.37 on no apparent investment. However, the most breathtaking of Mr. Wiggins' operations were in the stock of the Chase National Bank. These, in turn, were financed by the Chase Bank itself. In one exceptionally well-timed coup, Shermar Corporation, between September 23 and November 4, 1929, sold short 42,506 shares of Chase stock. For those to whom short selling is an unrevealed mystery, this meant, in effect, that it negotiated a loan of 42,506 shares and then sold them at the exceedingly good prices then obtaining. It did this with the intention of buying the same number of shares later at a lower price in order to repay in kind the lender who had provided the original stock. The profit from repaying shares bought at a lower price, always assuming that the price went down, would obviously accrue to Shermar. Prices did go down superbly. The short sale anticipated perfectly the crash. Then on December 11, 1929, Merlin Corporation, this was for another daughter, bought 42,506 shares of stock from an affiliate of the Chase National Bank and financed this purchase with a loan of $6,588,430 from the Chase National Bank and from the Shermar Corporation. These shares were used to cover Shermar's short sale, in other words, to repay the loan of securities. The profits on the operation, at a time when many other people were doing much, much less well, was $4,008,538. People of carping tendencies might hold the profit was earned by the bank, whose stock it was, whose officer Wiggin was, and which had provided the money for the operation. In fact, the gain all went to Wiggin. Mr. Wiggin subsequently defended loans by banks to their own officers to allow them to speculate in their own stock on the grounds that it developed an interest in their institution. However, by this line of reasoning, loans to finance short sales present a difficulty. Presumably, they develop an interest in having the institution, and hence its stock, behave as badly as possible. Pressed on this point, Mr. Wiggin expressed doubt as to whether officers should sell their own companies short. At the end of 1932, Mr. Wiggin requested that he not be re-elected chairman of the governing board of the bank. He was approaching 65, and he noted with some slight overstatement that his heart and energies had been concentrated for many years in promoting the growth, welfare, and usefulness of the Chase National Bank. It also seems probable that Winthrop W. Aldrich, who had come into the Chase as the result of a merger with the Equitable Trust Company, and who represented a more austere tradition in commercial banking, the Equitable was controlled by the Rockefellers, had come to regard Mr. Wiggin as dispensable. The executive committee of the Chase, in order to discharge in some measure the obligations of this bank to Mr. Wiggin, by unanimous action, voted him a life salary of $100,000. It was later brought out that this gesture of inspired generosity had been the impulse of Mr. Wiggin himself. In the months following Mr. Wiggin's retirement, his activities became a matter of detailed study by a Senate committee. Mr. Aldrich, his successor, confessed his surprise at the extent and diversity of his predecessor's enterprises. and said that the voting of the life salary was a terrible mistake. Mr. Wiggin later renounced the compensation. 3. By comparison with the National City, the troubles of the chase were slight. Mr. Wiggin was a reserved, some described him as a rather scholarly man. The head of the National City, Charles E. Mitchell, on the other hand, was a genial extrovert with a talent for headlines. He was known to one and all as a leading prophet of the new era. In the autumn of 1929, there were rumors in Wall Street that Mitchell would resign. He did not, and the rumors were described by Percy A. Rockefeller, an associate in numerous rather fervent stock market operations and a director of the bank, as too absurd to be considered by any sensible person. For the next 2 or 3 years, Mitchell was rather out of the news. Then, at 9 o'clock on the evening of March 21, 1933, he was arrested by Assistant U.S. District Attorney Thomas E. Dewey and charged with evasion of income taxes. Many of the facts were never seriously in dispute. Like Wiggin, Mitchell had been operating extensively in the stock of his own bank, although possibly for more defensible reasons. 1929 was a year of bank mergers, and Charles E. Mitchell was no man to resist a trend. By early autumn of 1929, he had all but completed a merger with the Corn Exchange Bank. The directors of the two institutions had approved. All that remained was the formality of ratification by the stockholders. Holders of Corn Exchange stock were to receive, at their option, 4/5 of a share of National City stock, or $360 in cash. The price of National City stock was then above $500, so it was certain that the Corn Exchange stockholders would take the stock. Then came the crash. The price of National City stock dropped to around $425, and at any price below $450, 4/5 of which equaled the $360 in cash, the stockholders of the Corn Exchange would take money. To buy out all the Corn Exchange stockholders for cash would cost the National City around $200 million. That was too much, so Mitchell undertook to save the deal. He began buying National City stock, and during the week of October 28th, he arranged to borrow $12 million from J.P. Morgan & Company, with which to buy more. $12 million was a sizable sum, both for Mitchell and for Morgan's, even at that time. Only $10 million was actually used, and of this, $4 million was repaid within a week or so. Possibly some of the Morgan partners had second thoughts on the wisdom of the loan. The coup failed. Like so many others, Mitchell learned how different it was to support a stock when everyone wanted to sell, as compared with those days but a few weeks back when everyone wanted to buy. The price of National City stock sank lower and lower. Mitchell reached the end of his resources and gave up. This was no time for false pride. And with some mild prodding from the management, the National City stockholders repudiated that management and rejected the now disastrous deal. Mitchell, however, was left with a formidable debt to J.P. Morgan & Company. This debt was secured by the stock that had been purchased to support the market and by Mitchell's personal holdings, but its value was shrinking grievously. By the end of the year, National City stock was near 200, down from more than 500, and close to the value at which Morgan's had accepted it as collateral. Now Mitchell faced another misfortune, or rather, an earlier piece of good fortune now became a disaster. As an executive of the National City Bank, Mitchell's pay was a modest $25,000. However, the bank had an incentive system which may still hold some sort of record for munificence. After a deduction of 8%, 20% of the profits of the bank and of its security affiliate, the National City Company, were paid into a management fund. This was divided twice a year between the principal officers by an arrangement which must have made for an interesting half hour. Each officer first dropped in a hat an unsigned ballot suggesting the share of the fund that Chairman Mitchell should have. Then each signed a ballot giving his estimate of the worth of each of the other eligible officers, himself excluded. The average of these estimates guided the executive committee of the bank in fixing the percentages of the fund each officer was to have. The years 1928 and 1929 were a time of excellent profits. Mitchell's subordinates had also taken a favorable view of his work. For the full year 1928, his cut was $1,316,634.14. 1929 was even better. The division at the end of the first half of that year brought him no less than $1,108,000. Dividends and numerous other activities had further augmented his income. And all of this meant a serious tax liability. It would have been easy to sell some National City stock and establish a tax loss, but, as noted, the stock was pledged with J.P. Morgan & Company. Nevertheless, Mitchell sold the stock to his wife. 18,300 shares were disposed of to this possibly unsuspecting lady at $212 for the exceedingly satisfying loss of $2,872,305.50. This wiped out all tax liability for 1929. Morgan's was not, it appears, notified of the change of ownership of the stock they held. Somewhat later, Mitchell reacquired the stock from his wife, also at a price of $212. Before then, there had been a further sickening slide in the price. And had Chairman Mitchell bought the stock in the open market rather than from his wife, he could have got it for around $40. Asked about the transaction by Senator Brookhart of Iowa during a Senate hearing, Mitchell, in a burst of candor that must have devastated his lawyer, said, "I sold this stock, frankly, for tax purposes." This frankness led directly to his indictment a few weeks later. Following his testimony, Mitchell had resigned from the National City Bank. His trial in New York during May and June of 1933 was something of a sensation, although the headlines were necessarily subordinate to the larger ones currently being made in Washington. In his inaugural address on March 4th, Roosevelt had promised to drive the money changers from the temple. Mitchell was widely regarded as the first. On June 22nd, Mitchell was acquitted by the jury on all counts. The sales, as required by the tax laws, were held to be bona fide transactions made in good faith. The Times reporter covering the trial thought that both Mitchell and his lawyer received the verdict with surprise. Attorney General Cummings said that he still believed in the jury system. Mitchell later resumed his career in Wall Street as head of Blythe & Company. The government entered a civil claim for the taxes and won a judgment of $1,100,000 in taxes and penalties. Mitchell appealed the case through to the Supreme Court, lost, and made a final settlement with the government on December 27, 1938. On his behalf, it must be stressed that the device by which he sought to reduce his tax liability was far more common then than now. The Senate investigations of 1933 and 1934 showed that tax avoidance had brought individuals of the highest respectability into extraordinary financial intercourse with their wives. 4. Our political tradition sets great store by the generalized symbol of evil. This is the wrongdoer, whose wrongdoing will be taken by the public to be the secret propensity of a whole community or class. We search avidly for such people, not so much because we wish to see them exposed and punished as individuals, but because we cherish the resulting political discomfort of their friends. To uncover an evil man among the friends of one's foes had long been a recognized method of advancing one's political fortunes. However, in recent times, the technique has been greatly improved and refined by the added firmness with which the evil of the evildoer is now attributed to friends, acquaintances, and all who share his way of life. In the 1930s, Wall Street was exceptionally well endowed with enemies. There were some socialists and communists who believed that capitalism should be abolished, and obviously did not seek to have its citadel preserved. There were some people who merely thought that Wall Street was bad. There were yet others who did not seek to have Wall Street abolished, or who did not care much about its allegedly evil ways, but who enjoyed, as a matter of course, the discomfiture of the rich and the powerful and the proud. There were those who had lost money in Wall Street. Most of all, there was the New Deal. The administrations of Coolidge and Hoover had had an extremely overt alliance with the great financial interests which Wall Street symbolized. With the advent of the New Deal, the sins of Wall Street became the sins of the political enemy. What was bad for Wall Street was bad for the Republican Party. For anyone who is in search of symbolic evil in Wall Street, of individuals whose misbehavior would stigmatize the whole community, the discovery that the heads of the National City and Chase had been guilty of grave lapses would seem to be almost ideal. These were the two best-known and most influential banks. What could have been better than default here? That the shortcomings of Mr. Wiggin and Mr. Mitchell were much welcomed is, of course, clear. Yet in some indefinable sense, they were not of that part of Wall Street that people suspected most. Wall Street's crime, in the eyes of its classical enemies, was less its power than its morals. And the center of immorality was not the banks, but the stock market. It was on the stock market that men gambled not alone with their own money, but with the wealth of the country. The stock market, with its promise of easy riches, was what led good, if not very wise men to perdition, like the cashier of the local bank, who was also a vestryman. The senseless gyrations of the stock market affected farm prices and land values and the renewal of notes and mortgages. Though to the sophisticated radical the banks might be the real menace, sound populist attitudes pointed the finger of suspicion at the New York Stock Exchange. There, accordingly, was the place, if possible, to find the symbol of evil, for there was the institution about which people were ready to believe the worst. The search for a really adequate miscreant in the stock exchange began in April of 1932. The task was undertaken by the Senate Committee on Banking and Currency, later by a subcommittee, and its instructions, graced by the usual split infinitive, were to thoroughly investigate practices of stock exchanges. Under the later guidance of Ferdinand Pecora, this committee became the scourge of commercial, investment, and private bankers. But this was not foreseen when it was organized. The original, and more or less exclusive object of the inquiry, was the market for securities. On the whole, this part of the investigation was unproductive. The first witness, when the hearings opened on April 11, 1932, was Richard Whitney. On November 30, 1929, the governing committee of the New York Stock Exchange had passed a resolution of appreciation for the efficient and conscientious labors of their acting president during the recent storm. It is an old saying, the resolution had stated, that great emergencies produce the men who are competent to deal with them. This sense of indebtedness made it inevitable that when Edward H. Simmons retired as president of the exchange in 1930, after 6 years in office, Whitney would be elected to succeed him. As president of the exchange, it thus fell to Whitney, in the spring of 1932, to assume the task of protecting the stock market from its critics. Whitney was not in all respects an ingratiating witness. One of his successors in office, not long ago, compared his general manner and bearing with that of Secretary of Defense Charles E. Wilson at the hearings on his confirmation as Secretary of Defense in early 1953. Whitney admitted to no serious fault in the past operations of the exchange, or even to the possibility of error. He supplied the information that was requested, but he was not unduly helpful to senators who sought to penetrate the mysteries of short selling, sales against the box, options, pools, and syndicates. He seemed to feel that these things were beyond the senator's intelligence. Alternatively, he implied that they were things that every intelligent schoolboy understood, and it was painful for him to have to go over the obvious. He was so unwise as to get into a discussion of personal economic philosophy with Senator Smith W. Brookhart of Iowa, one of the committee members who believed, devoutly, that the exchange was the particular invention of the devil. The government, not Wall Street, was responsible for the current bad times, Whitney averred, and the government, he believed, could make its greatest contribution to recovery by balancing the budget and thus restoring confidence. To balance the budget, he recommended cutting the pensions and benefits of veterans who had no service-connected disability and also all government salaries. When asked about cutting his own pay, he said no. It was very little. Pressed for the amount, he said that currently it was only about $60,000. His attention was drawn by the committee members to the fact that this was 6 times what a senator received. But Whitney remained adamantly in favor of cutting the public pay, including that of senators. In spite of Whitney's manner, or possibly because of it, several days of questioning produced little evidence of wrongdoing and no identification of wrongdoers. Prior to the crash, Whitney had heard generally of syndicates and pools, but he could give no details. He repeatedly assured the committee that the exchange had these and other matters well under control. He took exception to Senator Brookhart's contention that the market was a gambling hell and should be padlocked. In the end, Whitney was excused before he had quite completed his testimony. When the interrogation of Whitney showed clear signs of being unproductive, the committee turned to the famous market operators. These, too, were disappointing. All that could be proved was what everyone knew, namely that Bernard E. Selim Ben Smith, M.J. Meehan, Arthur W. Cutton, Harry F. Sinclair, Percy A. Rockefeller, and others had been engaged in large-scale efforts to rig the market. Harry F. Sinclair, for example, was shown to have engaged in especially extensive operations in Sinclair Consolidated Oil. This was much like identifying William Z. Foster with the Communist Party. It was impossible to imagine Harry Sinclair not being involved in some intricate maneuver in high finance. Moreover, reprehensible as these activities were, it remained that only 3 short years before they had been regarded with breathless admiration. The problem here was somewhat similar to that encountered in the Great Red Hunt of the latter 40s. Then there was constant embarrassment over the short time that had elapsed since Red Russia had been our gallant Soviet ally. It is true that the big operators, as they appeared on the stand, were not an especially prepossessing group. As noted earlier, Arthur Cutton's memory was extremely defective. M.J. Meehan was in bad health and mistakenly went abroad when he was supposed to go to Washington. He later apologized handsomely for the error. Few of the others could remember much about their operations, Napoleonic though they had once seemed. But men cannot be brought to trial for being unprepossessing, and the dubious demeanor and bad memories of the market operators did not directly involve the reputation of the New York Stock Exchange. It is possible to have a poor view of touts, tipsters, and bookies without thinking the worse of Churchill Downs. In earlier times of trouble on the stock market, stock exchange firms had failed, on occasion by the score. In the fall of 1929, the failures were unimportant. In the first week of the crash, no member firm of the New York Stock Exchange had to suspend. Only one smallish member firm went under during the period of the panic. There were some complaints by customers of mistreatment, but there were more customers who, during the worst days, were carried by their brokers after their margins had been impaired or depleted. The standards of commercial morality of the members of the exchange would seem to have been well up to the average of the late 20s. They may have been much more rigorous. This would seem to be the most obvious explanation why the exchange and its members survived so well the investigations of the 30s. They did not come through unscathed, but they suffered no obloquy comparable, say, with that of the great bankers. In the congressional investigations, no flagrant miscreant of any kind was uncovered on the exchange to serve as the symbolic bad apple. Then, on March 10, 1938, District Attorney Thomas E. Dewey, who had arrested Charles E. Mitchell and who somehow has escaped a reputation as the nemesis of Wall Street, ordered the arraignment of Richard Whitney. The charge was grand larceny. 5. The rush to get in on the act, to use the recent idiom, when Whitney was arrested, is a measure of the yearning for a malefactor in the stock market. It can be compared only with the stampede which followed the announcement by Attorney General Herbert Brownell in the autumn of 1953 that former President Truman had shielded treason. On the day following his first arrest, Whitney was arrested again by New York State Attorney General John J. Bennett. Mr. Bennett had been conducting an investigation of Whitney's affairs, and he bitterly accused Mr. Dewey of legal claim jumping. In the next few weeks, virtually every public body or tribunal with a plausible excuse for doing so called Whitney to enlarge on his wrongdoing. The detailed story of Richard Whitney's misfortunes do not belong to this chronicle. Many of them occurred after the period with which this history is concerned. There is need here to cover only those operations that were deemed to implicate the market. Whitney's dishonesty was of a casual, rather juvenile sort. Associates of the day have since explained it as the result of an unfortunate failure to realize that the rules, which were meant for other people, also applied to him. Much more striking than Whitney's dishonesty was the clear fact that he was one of the most disastrous businessmen in modern history. Theft was almost a minor incident pertaining to his business misfortunes. In the 1920s, the Wall Street firm of Richard Whitney and Company was an unspectacular bond house with a modest business. Whitney apparently felt that it provided insufficient scope for his imagination, and with the passing years he moved on to other enterprises, including the mining of mineral colloids and the marketing of peat humus in Florida. He had also become interested in the distilling of alcoholic beverages, mainly Applejack, in New Jersey. Nothing is so voracious as a losing business, and eventually Whitney had 3 of them. To keep them going, he borrowed from banks, investment bankers, other stock exchange members, and heavily from his brother, George Whitney, a partner of J.P. Morgan & Company. The loans so negotiated, from the early 1920s on, totaled in the millions, many of them unsecured. As time passed, Whitney was increasingly pressed. When one loan became due, he was forced to replace it with another, and to borrow still more for the interest on those outstanding. Beginning in 1933, his stock exchange firm was insolvent, although this did not become evident for some 5 years. Finally, like so many others, Richard Whitney learned the cost of supporting a stock on a falling market. In 1933, Richard Whitney and Company, the affairs of Whitney and his company were almost completely indistinguishable, had invested in between 10 and 15,000 shares of Distilled Liquors Corporation, the New Jersey manufacturer of Applejack and other intoxicants. The price was $15 a share. In the spring of 1934, the stock reached 45 in over-the-counter trading. In January 1935, it was listed on the New York Curb Exchange. Inevitably, Whitney posted the stock as collateral for various of his loans. Unhappily, popular enthusiasm for the products of the firm, even in the undiscriminating days following repeal, was remarkably slight. The firm made no money, and by June 1936, the price of the stock was down to 11. This drop had a disastrous effect on its value as collateral, and the unhappy Whitney tried to maintain the value by buying more of it. He later made the claim that he wanted to provide the other investors in the company with a market for their stock, which, if true, meant that he was engaging in one of the most selfless acts since the death of Sidney Carton. All the other investors unloaded on Whitney. At the time of his failure, of the 148,750 shares outstanding, Whitney, or his firm, owned 137,672. By then, the value had dropped to between $3 and $4 a share. Mention has been made of the tendency of people in this period to swindle themselves. Whitney, in his effort to support the stock of Distilled Liquors Corporation, unquestionably emerged as the Ponzi of financial self-deception. As the result of his operation, he had all his old debts, many new ones incurred in supporting the stock, all the stock, and the stock was nearly worthless. As his position became more complex, Richard Whitney resorted increasingly to an expedient which he had been using for several years, that of posting securities belonging to other people, which were in his custody as collateral for his loans. By early 1938, he had reached the end of a surprising capacity to borrow money. Late in the preceding autumn, he had had a large last loan from his brother to release securities belonging to the gratuity fund of the stock exchange, a fund out of which payments were made on the death of members, which he had appropriated and pledged for a bank loan. He was now desperately, almost pathetically, visiting the most casual of acquaintances in search of funds. The rumor spread that he was in poor condition. Still, on March 8th, there was a stunned silence on the floor of the exchange when President Charles R. Gay announced from the rostrum the suspension of Richard Whitney and Company for insolvency. Members were rather more aghast when they learned that Whitney had been engaged in theft on a large scale for a long period. With no small dignity, Whitney made a full disclosure of his operations, refused to enter any sort of plea in his own defense, and passed permanently from sight. 6. The failure of the smallest country banker caused more personal hardship, anguish, and privation than the insolvency of Richard Whitney. His victims were almost uniquely able to afford their loss, and the sums which he stole, while substantial, did not place him in the ranks of the great defaulters of the day. They would not have paid the interest on Ivar Kruger's larceny for a year. Yet, from the point of view of the antagonists of Wall Street, his default was ideal. Rarely has a crime been more joyously received. Whitney's identification was wholly with the stock exchange, the symbolic center of sin. Moreover, he had been its president and its uncompromising defender before the Congress and the public in its period of trial. He was a Republican, an arch-conservative, and was loosely associated in the financial community with J.P. Morgan and Company. He had himself taken a strong position in favor of honesty. Speaking in St. Louis in 1932, at a time when his own larceny was already well advanced, Whitney had said sternly that one of the prime necessities of a great market is that brokers must be honest and financially responsible. He looked forward to the day when the financial supervision by the exchange of its members would be so strict that failure will be next to impossible. Finally, even by his colleagues, Whitney was regarded as a trifle upstage. In his last days, he had been reduced to the ultimate indignity of trying to borrow money from the market operator, Bernard E. Smith. Smith, at best a lower middle-brow figure, later told a Securities and Exchange Commission examiner, "He came up to see me and said he would like to get this over quickly, and told me he would like to borrow $250,000 on his face. I remarked he was putting a pretty high value on his face. So he said his back was to the wall and he had to have $250,000. I told him he had a lot of nerve to ask me for $250,000 when he didn't even bid me the time of day. I told him I frankly didn't like him, that I wouldn't loan him a dime. On any free vote for the man best qualified to bring discredit to Wall Street, Whitney would have won by a wide margin." The parallel between Whitney and a more recent culprit is interesting. During the 30s, the New Dealers were exuberantly uncovering the financial derelictions of their opposition. It is interesting that dishonesty, and not the more orthodox offenses of capitalism like abuse of power or the exploitation of the people, were in these days the nemesis of conservatives. In the 1940s and 50s, Republicans, as avidly, were discovering that there were New Dealers who had been communists. Thus it came about that a decade later, the counterpart of Richard Whitney was Alger Hiss. Each served admirably the enemies of his class. Each, in origin, education, associations, and career pretension, epitomized that class. In each case, the first reaction of friends to the allegations of guilt was disbelief. Whitney's past role in his community had been more prominent, and hence, from the viewpoint of his enemies, he was a more satisfactory figure than Alger Hiss. In the government hierarchy, Hiss was a distinctly routine figure. His eminence as a global statesman was synthesized ex post facto, and he also gained much prominence during 2 long trials. Whitney, with no fanfare, accepted his fate. There is perhaps a moral worth drawing from the careers of Whitney and Hiss. Neither the fact that Whitney was convicted of purloining securities, nor that Hiss purloined documents, is convincing proof that their friends, associates, and contemporaries were doing the same. On the contrary, the evidence would indicate that most brokers were honest as a matter of absolute routine, and most New Dealers, so far from being in league with the Russians, wished only that they might be invited once to taste caviar at the Soviet embassy. Both liberals and conservatives, left and right, have now had personal experience with the use of the symbolic evil. The injustice of the device is evident. What may be a more compelling point, so are its dangers. In accordance with an old but not outworn tradition, it might now be wise for all to conclude that crime, or even misbehavior, is the act of an individual, not the predisposition of a class. 7. The Whitney affair brought a marked change in the relations between the exchange and the federal government, and in some measure between the exchange and the general public. In the Securities Act of 1933, and more comprehensively in the Securities Exchange Act of 1934, the government had sought to prohibit some of the more spectacular extravagances of 1928 and 1929. Full disclosure was required on new security issues, although no way was found of making would-be investors read what was disclosed. Inside operations and short selling, after the manner of Mr. Wiggin, were outlawed. Authority was given to the Federal Reserve Board to fix margin requirements, and these could, if necessary, be made 100%, and thus eliminate margin trading entirely. Pool operations, wash sales, the dissemination of tips or patently false information, and other devices for rigging or manipulating the market were prohibited. Commercial banks were divorced from their securities affiliates. Most important, the principle was enunciated that the New York Stock Exchange and the other exchanges were subject to public regulation, and the Securities and Exchange Commission was established to apply and enforce such regulation. This was somewhat bitter medicine. Moreover, regulatory bodies, like the people who comprise them, have a marked life cycle. In youth, they are vigorous, aggressive, evangelistic, and even intolerant. Later, they mellow, and in old age, after a matter of 10 or 15 years, they become, with some exceptions, either an arm of the industry they are regulating or senile. The SEC was especially aggressive. To any young regulatory body, after all, Wall Street was certain to seem a challenging antagonist. Until the Whitney affair, Wall Street, always with exceptions, was disposed to fight back. It insisted on the right of a financial community in general, and of a securities market in particular, to conduct its affairs in its own way, by its own lights, and to govern itself. On the evening before the suspension of Whitney was announced from the rostrum, Charles R. Gay, the president of the exchange, and Howland S. Davis, chairman of the Committee on Business Conduct, Whitney had been a predecessor of both in the two offices, made their way to Washington. There, they reported their unhappy news to William O. Douglas and John W. Haynes of the SEC. The trip, in far more than a symbolic sense, represented the surrender of the exchange. The Cold War over-regulation came to an end and was not thereafter resumed. While the Whitney default confirmed the victory of the New Deal on the issue of regulation, and also served admirably to confirm the more general suspicion of moral delinquency in downtown New York, it was Wall Street's good fortune that it came late. By 1938, the New Deal assault on big business was on the wane. Some leaders of the original shock troops were already polishing up speeches on the virtues of the free enterprise system. By then also, it was accepted New Deal theology that all necessary economic reforms had been revealed, and those that had not been enacted were on request from Congress. No further reforms of the securities markets of any importance were on the agenda. Henceforth, Wall Street looked ingratiatingly at Washington, and Washington merely looked blank. Chapter 9. Cause and Consequence. After the Great Crash came the Great Depression, which lasted, with varying severity, for 10 years. In 1933, gross national product, total production of the economy, was nearly a third less than in 1929. Not until 1937 did the physical volume of production recover to the levels of 1929, and then it promptly slipped back again. Until 1941, the dollar value of production remained below 1929. Between 1930 and 1940, only once, in 1937, did the average number unemployed during the year drop below 8 million. In 1933, nearly 13 million were out of work, or about 1 in every 4 in the labor force. In 1938, 1 person in 5 was still out of work. It was during this dreary time that 1929 became a year of myth. People hoped that the country might get back to 29. In some industries or towns, when business was phenomenally good, it was almost as good as in 29. Men of outstanding vision, on occasions of exceptional solemnity, were heard to say that 1929 was no better than Americans deserve. On the whole, the great stock market crash can be much more readily explained than the depression that followed it. And among the problems involved in assessing the causes of depression, none is more intractable than the responsibility to be assigned to the stock market crash. Economics still does not allow final answers on these matters, but as usual, something can be said. 2. As already so often emphasized, the collapse in the stock market in the autumn of 1929 was implicit in the speculation that went before. The only question concerning that speculation was how long it would last. Sometime, sooner or later, confidence in the short-run reality of increasing common stock values would weaken. When this happened, some people would sell, and this would destroy the reality of increasing values. Holding for an increase would now become meaningless. The new reality would be falling prices. There would be a rush, pell-mell, to unload. This was the way past speculative orgies had ended. It was the way the end came in 1929. It is the way speculation will end in the future. We do not know why a great speculative orgy occurred in 1928 and 1929. The long-accepted explanation that credit was easy, and so people were impelled to borrow money to buy common stocks on margin, is obviously nonsense. On numerous occasions before and since, credit has been easy, and there has been no speculation whatever. Furthermore, much of the 1928 and 1929 speculation occurred on money borrowed at interest rates which, for years before, and in any period since, would have been considered exceptionally astringent. Money, by the ordinary tests, was tight in the late 20s. Far more important than rate of interest and the supply of credit is the mood. Speculation on a large scale requires a pervasive sense of confidence and optimism and conviction that ordinary people were meant to be rich. People must also have faith in the good intentions and even in the benevolence of others. For it is by the agency of others that they will get rich. In 1929, Professor Dice observed, "The common folks believe in their leaders. We no longer look upon the captains of industry as magnified crooks. Have we not heard their voices over the radio? Are we not familiar with their thoughts, ambitions, and ideals as they have expressed them to us almost as a man talks to his friend?" Such a feeling of trust is essential for a boom. When people are cautious, questioning, misanthropic, suspicious, or mean, they are immune to speculative enthusiasms. Savings must also be plentiful. Speculation, however it may rely on borrowed funds, must be nourished in part by those who participate. If savings are growing rapidly, people will place a lower marginal value on their accumulation. They will be willing to risk some of it against the prospect of a greatly enhanced return. Speculation, accordingly, is most likely to break out after a substantial period of prosperity, rather than in the early phases of recovery from a depression. Macaulay noted that between the Restoration and the Glorious Revolution, Englishmen were at a loss to know what to do with their savings, and that the natural effect of this state of things was that a crowd of projectors, ingenious and absurd, honest and knavish, employed themselves in devising new schemes for the employment of redundant capital. Bagehot and others have attributed the South Sea bubble to roughly the same causes. In 1720, England had enjoyed a long period of prosperity, enhanced in part by war expenditures, and during this time, private savings are believed to have grown at an unprecedented rate. Investment outlets were also few and returns low. Accordingly, Englishmen were anxious to place their savings at the disposal of the new enterprises, and were quick to believe that the prospects were not fantastic. So it was in 1928 and 1929. Finally, a speculative outbreak has a greater or less immunizing effect. The ensuing collapse automatically destroys the very mood speculation requires. It follows that an outbreak of speculation provides a reasonable assurance that another outbreak will not immediately occur. With time and the dimming of memory, the immunity wears off. A recurrence becomes possible. Nothing would have induced Americans to launch a speculative adventure in the stock market in 1935. By 1955, the chances are very much better. 3. As noted, it is easier to account for the boom and crash in the market than to explain their bearing on the depression which followed. The causes of the Great Depression are still far from certain. A lack of certainty, it may also be observed, is not evident in the contemporary writing on the subject. Much of it tells what went wrong and why with marked firmness. However, this paradoxically can itself be an indication of uncertainty. When people are least sure, they are often most dogmatic. We do not know what the Russians intend, so we state with great assurance what they will do. We compensate for our inability to foretell the consequences of, say, rearming Germany by asserting positively just what the consequences will be. So it is in economics. Yet in explaining what happened in 1929 and after, one can distinguish between explanations that might be right and those that are clearly wrong. A great many people have always felt that a depression was inevitable in the 30s. There had been at least 7 good years. Now, by an occult or biblical law of compensation, there would have to be 7 bad ones. Perhaps, consciously or unconsciously, an argument that was valid for the stock market was brought to bear on the economy in general. Because the market took leave of reality in 1928 and 1929, it had at some time to make a return to reality. The disenchantment was bound to be as painful as the illusions were beguiling. Similarly, the new era prosperity would someday evaporate. In its wake would come the compensating hardship. There is also the slightly more subtle conviction that economic life is governed by an inevitable rhythm. After a certain time, prosperity destroys itself, and depression corrects itself. In 1929, prosperity, in accordance with the dictates of the business cycle, had run its course. This was the faith confessed by the members of the Harvard Economic Society in the spring of 1929, when they concluded that a recession was somehow overdue. Neither of these beliefs can be seriously supported. The 20s, by being comparatively prosperous, established no imperative that the 30s be depressed. In the past, good times have given way to less good times, and less good or bad to good. But change is normal in a capitalist economy. The degree of regularity in such movements is not great, though often thought to be. No inevitable rhythm required the collapse and stagnation of 1930 to 1940. Nor was the economy of the United States in 1929 subject to such physical pressure or strain as the result of its past level of performance that a depression was bound to come. The notion that the economy requires occasional rest and resuscitation has a measure of plausibility and also a marked viability. During the summer of 1954, a professional economist on President Eisenhower's personal staff explained the then current recession by saying that the economy was enjoying a brief, and presumably well-merited, rest after the exceptional exertions of preceding years. In 1929, the labor force was not tired. It could have continued to produce indefinitely at the best 1929 rate. The capital plant of the country was not depleted. In the preceding years of prosperity, plant had been renewed and improved. In fact, depletion of the capital plant occurred during the ensuing years of idleness, when new investment was sharply curtailed. Raw materials in 1929 were ample for the current rate of production. Entrepreneurs were never more eupeptic. Obviously, if men, materials, plant, and management were all capable of continued and even enlarged exertions, a refreshing pause was not necessary. Finally, the high production of the 20s did not, as some have suggested, outrun the wants of the people. During these years, people were indeed being supplied with an increasing volume of goods. But there is no evidence that their desire for automobiles, clothing, travel, recreation, or even food was sated. On the contrary, all subsequent evidence showed, given the income to spend, a capacity for a large further increase in consumption. A depression was not needed so that people's wants could catch up with their capacity to produce. 4. What, then, are the plausible causes of the depression? The task of answering can be simplified somewhat by dividing the problem into two parts. First, there is the question of why economic activity turned down in 1929. Second, there is the vastly more important question of why, having started down, on this unhappy occasion it went down and down and down and remained low for a full decade. As noted, the Federal Reserve indexes of industrial activity and of factory production, the most comprehensive monthly measures of economic activity then available, reached a peak in June. They then turned down and continued to decline throughout the rest of the year. The turning point in other indicators, factory payrolls, freight car loadings, and department store sales, came later. And it was October or after before the trend in all of them was clearly down. Still, as economists have generally insisted, and the matter has the high authority of the National Bureau of Economic Research, the economy had weakened in the early summer, well before the crash. This weakening can be variously explained. Production of industrial products, for the moment, had outrun consumer and investment demand for them. The most likely reason is that business concerns, in the characteristic enthusiasm of good times, misjudged the prospective increase in demand and acquired larger inventories than they later found they needed. As a result, they curtailed their buying, and this led to a cutback in production. In short, the summer of 1929 marked the beginning of the familiar inventory recession. The proof is not conclusive from the, by present standards, limited figures available. Department store inventories, for which figures are available, seem not to have been out of line early in the year, but a mild slump in department store sales in April could have been a signal for curtailment. Also, there is a chance, one that students of the period have generally favored, that more deep-seated factors were at work and made themselves seriously evident for the first time during that summer. Throughout the 20s, production and productivity per worker grew steadily. Between 1919 and 1929, output per worker in manufacturing industries increased by about 43%. Wages, salaries, and prices all remained comparatively stable, or in any case underwent no comparable increase. Accordingly, costs fell, and with prices the same, profits increased. These profits sustained the spending of the well-to-do, and they also nourished at least some of the expectations behind the stock market boom. Most of all, they encouraged a very high level of capital investment. During the 20s, the production of capital goods increased at an average annual rate of 6.4% a year. Non-durable consumers' goods, a category which includes such objects of mass consumption as food and clothing, increased at a rate of only 2.8%. The rate of increase for durable consumers' goods, such as cars, dwellings, home furnishings, and the like, much of it representing expenditures of the well-off to well-to-do, was 5.9%. A large and increasing investment in capital goods was, in other words, a principal device by which the profits were being spent. It follows that anything that interrupted the investment outlays, anything indeed which kept them from showing the necessary rate of increase, could cause trouble. When this occurred, compensation through an increase in consumer spending could not automatically be expected. The effect, therefore, of insufficient investment that failed to keep pace with the steady increase in profits, could be falling total demand, reflected in turn in falling orders and output. Again, there is no final proof of this point, for unfortunately, we do not know how rapidly investment had to grow to keep abreast of the current increase in profits. However, the explanation is broadly consistent with the facts. There are other possible explanations of the downturn. Back of the insufficient advance in investment may have been the high interest rates. Perhaps, although less probably, trouble was transmitted to the economy as a whole from some weak sector like agriculture. Further explanations could be offered, but one thing about this experience is clear. Until well along in the autumn of 1929, the downturn was limited. The recession in business activity was modest, and underemployment relatively slight. Up to November, it was possible to argue that not much of anything had happened. On other occasions, as noted, in 1924 and 1927, and of late in 1949, the economy has undergone similar recession. But unlike these other occasions, in 1929 the recession continued and got violently worse. This is the unique feature of the 1929 experience. This is what we need really to understand. 5. There seems little question that in 1929, modifying a famous cliché, the economy was fundamentally unsound. This is a circumstance of first-rate importance. Many things were wrong, but 5 weaknesses seem to have had an especially intimate bearing on the ensuing disaster. They are: 1. The bad distribution of income. In 1929, the rich were indubitably rich. The figures are not entirely satisfactory, but it seems certain that the 5% of the population with the highest incomes in that year received approximately 1/3 of all personal income. The proportion of personal income received in the form of interest, dividends, and rent, the income broadly speaking of the well-to-do, was about twice as great as in the years following the Second World War. This highly unequal income distribution meant that the economy was dependent on a high level of investment or a high level of luxury consumer spending, or both. The rich cannot buy great quantities of bread. If they are to dispose of what they receive, it must be on luxuries or by way of investment in new plants and new projects. Both investment and luxury spending are subject, inevitably, to more erratic influences and to wider fluctuations than the bread and rent outlays of the $25-a-week workman. This high-bracket spending and investment was especially susceptible, one may assume, to the crushing news from the stock market in October of 1929. 2. The bad corporate structure. In November 1929, a few weeks after the crash, the Harvard Economic Society gave, as a principal reason why a depression need not be feared, its reasoned judgment that business in most lines has been conducted with prudence and conservatism. The fact was that American enterprise in the 20s had opened its hospitable arms to an exceptional number of promoters, grafters, swindlers, impostors, and frauds. This, in the long history of such activities, was a kind of flood tide of corporate larceny. The most important corporate weakness was inherent in the vast new structure of holding companies and investment trusts. The holding companies controlled large segments of the utility, railroad, and entertainment business. Here, as with the investment trusts, was the constant danger of devastation by reverse leverage. In particular, dividends from the operating companies paid the interest on the bonds of upstream holding companies. The interruption of the dividends meant default on the bonds, bankruptcy, and the collapse of the structure. Under these circumstances, the temptation to curtail investment in operating plant in order to continue dividends was obviously strong. This added to deflationary pressures. The latter, in turn, curtailed earnings and helped bring down the corporate pyramids. When this happened, even more retrenchment was inevitable. Income was earmarked for debt repayment. Borrowing for new investment became impossible. It would be hard to imagine a corporate system better designed to continue and accentuate a deflationary spiral. 3. The bad banking structure. Since the early 30s, a generation of Americans has been told, sometimes with amusement, sometimes with indignation, often with outrage, of the banking practices of the late 20s. In fact, many of these practices were made ludicrous only by the Depression. Loans which would have been perfectly good were made perfectly foolish by the collapse of the borrower's prices, or the markets for his goods, or the value of the collateral he had posted. The most responsible bankers, those who saw that their debtors were victims of circumstances far beyond their control and sought to help, were often made to look the worst. The bankers yielded, as did others, to the blithe, optimistic, and immoral mood of times, but probably not more so. A depression such as that of 1929 to 1932, were it to begin as this is written, would also be damaging to many currently impeccable banking reputations. However, although the bankers were not unusually foolish in 1929, the banking structure was inherently weak. The weakness was implicit in the large numbers of independent units. When one bank failed, the assets of others were frozen, while depositors elsewhere had a pregnant warning to go and ask for their money. Thus, one failure led to other failures, and these spread with a domino effect. Even in the best of times, local misfortune or isolated mismanagement could start such a chain reaction. In the first 6 months of 1929, 346 banks failed in various parts of the country, with aggregate deposits of nearly $115 million. When income, employment, and values fell as the result of a depression, bank failures could quickly become epidemic. This happened after 1929. Again, it would be hard to imagine a better arrangement for magnifying the effects of fear. The weak destroyed not only the other weak, but weakened the strong. People everywhere, rich and poor, were made aware of the disaster by the persuasive intelligence that their savings had been destroyed. Needless to say, such a banking system, once in the convulsions of failure, had a uniquely repressive effect on the spending of its depositors and the investment of its clients. 4. The dubious state of the foreign balance. This is a familiar story. During the First World War, the United States became a creditor on international account. In the decade following, the surplus of exports over imports, which once had paid the interest and principal on loans from Europe, continued. The high tariffs, which restricted imports and helped to create this surplus of exports, remained. However, history and traditional trading habits also accounted for the persistence of the favorable balance, so-called. Before, payments on interest and principal had, in effect, been deducted from the trade balance. Now that the United States was a creditor, they were added to this balance. The latter, it should be said, was not huge. In only 1 year, 1928, did the excess of exports over imports come to as much as $1 billion. In 1923 and 1926, it was only about $375 million. However, large or small, this difference had to be covered. Other countries which were buying more than they sold, and had debt payments to make in addition, had somehow to find the means for making up the deficit in their transactions with the United States. During most of the 20s, the difference was covered by cash, in other words, gold payments to the United States, and by new private loans by the United States to other countries. Most of the loans were to governments, national, state, or municipal bodies, and a large proportion were to Germany and Central and South America. The underwriters' margins in handling these loans were generous. The public took them up with enthusiasm. Competition for the business was keen. If, unfortunately, corruption and bribery were required as competitive instruments, these were used. In late 1927, Juan Leguía, the son of the president of Peru, was paid $450,000 by J&W Seligman and Company and the National City Company, the security affiliate of the National City Bank, for his services in connection with a $50 million loan which these houses marketed for Peru. Juan's services, according to later testimony, were of a rather negative sort. He was paid for not blocking the deal. The chase extended President Machado of Cuba, a dictator with a marked predisposition toward murder, a generous personal line of credit, which at one time reached $200,000. Machado's son-in-law was employed by the chase. The bank did a large business in Cuban bonds. In contemplating these loans, there was a tendency to pass quickly over anything that might appear to the disadvantage of the creditor. Mr. Victor Schoperle, a vice president of the National City Company with responsibility for Latin American loans, made the following appraisal of Peru as a credit prospect. Peru: bad debt record, adverse moral and political risk, bad internal debt situation, trade situation about as satisfactory as that of Chile in the past 3 years. Natural resources more varied. On economic showing, Peru should go ahead rapidly in the next 10 years. On such showing, the National City Company floated a $15 million loan for Peru, followed a few months later by a $50 million loan, and some 10 months thereafter by a $25 million issue. Peru did prove a highly adverse political risk. President Leguía, who negotiated the loans, was thrown violently out of office, and the loans went into default. In all respects, these operations were as much a part of the new era as Shenandoah and Blue Ridge. They were also just as fragile. And once the illusions of the new era were dissipated, they came as abruptly to an end. This, in turn, forced a fundamental revision in the foreign economic position of the United States. Countries could not cover their adverse trade balance with the United States with increased payments of gold, at least not for long. This meant that they had either to increase their exports to the United States, or reduce their imports, or default on their past loans. President Hoover and the Congress moved promptly to eliminate the first possibility, that the accounts would be balanced by larger imports, by sharply increasing the tariff. Accordingly, debts, including war debts, went into default, and there was a precipitate fall in American exports. The reduction was not vast in relation to total output of the American economy, but it contributed to the general distress and was especially hard on farmers. 5. The poor state of economic intelligence. To regard the people of any time as particularly obtuse seems vaguely improper, and it also establishes a precedent which members of this generation might regret. Yet it seems certain that the economists and those who offered economic counsel in the late 20s and early 30s were almost uniquely perverse. In the months and years following the stock market crash, the burden of reputable economic advice was invariably on the side of measures that would make things worse. In November of 1929, Mr. Hoover announced a cut in taxes. In the great no business conferences that followed, he asked business firms to keep up their capital investment and to maintain wages. Both of these measures were on the side of increasing spendable income, though unfortunately they were largely without effect. The tax reductions were negligible, except in the higher income brackets. Businessmen who promised to maintain investment and wages, in accordance with a well-understood convention, considered the promise binding only for the period within which it was not financially disadvantageous to do so. As a result, investment outlays and wages were not reduced until circumstances would in any case have brought their reduction. Still, the effort was in the right direction. Thereafter, policy was almost entirely on the side of making things worse. Asked how the government could best advance recovery, the sound and responsible advisor urged that the budget be balanced. Both parties agreed on this. For Republicans, the balanced budget was, as ever, high doctrine. But the Democratic Party platform of 1932, with an explicitness which politicians rarely advise, also called for a federal budget annually balanced on the basis of accurate executive estimates within revenues. A commitment to a balanced budget is always comprehensive. It then meant there could be no increase in government outlays to expand purchasing power and relieve distress. It meant there could be no further tax reduction. But taken literally, it meant much more. From 1930 on, the budget was far out of balance. And balance, therefore, meant an increase in taxes, a reduction in spending, or both. The Democratic platform in 1932 called for an immediate and drastic reduction of governmental expenditures to accomplish at least a 25% decrease in the cost of government. The balanced budget was not a subject of thought, nor was it, as often asserted, precisely a matter of faith. Rather, it was a formula. For centuries, avoidance of borrowing had protected people from slovenly or reckless public housekeeping. Slovenly or reckless keepers of the public purse had often composed complicated arguments to show why balance of income and outlay was not a mark of virtue. Experience had shown that however convenient this belief might seem in the short run, discomfort or disaster followed in the long run. Those simple precepts of a simple world did not hold amid the growing complexities of the early 30s. Mass unemployment in particular had altered the rules. Events had played a very bad trick on people, but almost no one tried to think out the problem anew. The balanced budget was not the only straitjacket on policy. There was also the bogey of going off the gold standard, and most surprisingly, of risking inflation. Until 1932, the United States added formidably to its gold reserves, and instead of inflation, the country was experiencing the most violent deflation in the nation's history. Yet every sober advisor saw dangers here, including the danger of runaway price increases. Americans, though in years now well in the past, had shown a penchant for tinkering with the money supply and enjoying the brief but heady joys of a boom in prices. In 1931 or 1932, the danger or even the feasibility of such a boom was nil. The advisors and counselors were not, however, analyzing the danger or even the possibility. They were serving only as the custodians of bad memories. The fear of inflation reinforced the demand for the balanced budget. It also limited efforts to make interest rates low, credit plentiful, or at least redundant, and borrowing as easy as possible under the circumstances. Devaluation of the dollar was, of course, flatly ruled out. This directly violated the gold standard rules. At best, in such depression times, monetary policy is a feeble reed on which to lean. The current economic cliches did not allow even the use of that frail weapon. And again, these attitudes were above party. Though himself singularly open-minded, Roosevelt was careful not to offend or disturb his followers. In a speech in Brooklyn toward the close of the 1932 campaign, he said, "The Democratic platform specifically declares, 'We advocate a sound currency to be preserved at all hazards.' That is plain English. In discussing this platform on July 30, I said, 'Sound money is an international necessity, not a domestic consideration for one nation alone. Far up in the Northwest, at Butte, I repeated the pledge. In Seattle, I reaffirmed my attitude.'" The following February, Mr. Hoover set forth his view, as often before, in a famous letter to the President-elect. "It would steady the country greatly if there could be prompt assurance that there will be no tampering or inflation of the currency, that the budget will be unquestionably balanced even if further taxation is necessary, that the government credit will be maintained by refusal to exhaust it in the issue of securities." The rejection of both fiscal, tax and expenditure, and monetary policy amounted precisely to a rejection of all affirmative government economic policy. The economic advisors of the day had both the unanimity and the authority to force the leaders of both parties to disavow all the available steps to check deflation and depression. In its own way, this was a marked achievement, a triumph of dogma over thought. The consequences were profound. 6. It is in light of the above weaknesses of the economy that the role of the stock market crash in the great tragedy of the 30s must be seen. The years of self-depreciation by Wall Street to the contrary, the role is one of respectable importance. The collapse in securities values affected in the first instance the wealthy and the well-to-do. But we see that in the world of 1929, this was a vital group. The members disposed of a large proportion of the consumer income. They were the source of a lion's share of personal saving and investment. Anything that struck at the spending or investment by this group would, of necessity, have broad effects on expenditure and income in the economy at large. Precisely such a blow was struck by the stock market crash. In addition, the crash promptly removed from the economy the support that it had been deriving from the spending of stock market gains. The stock market crash was also an exceptionally effective way of exploiting the weaknesses of the corporate structure. Operating companies, at the end of the holding company chain, were forced by the crash to retrench. The subsequent collapse of these systems, and also of the investment trusts, effectively destroyed both the ability to borrow and the willingness to lend for investment. What have long looked like purely fiduciary effects were, in fact, quickly translated into declining orders and increasing unemployment. The crash was also effective in bringing to an end the foreign lending by which the international accounts had been balanced. Now the accounts had, in the main, to be balanced by reduced exports. This put prompt and heavy pressure on export markets for wheat, cotton, and tobacco. Perhaps the foreign loans had only delayed an adjustment in the balance which had one day to come. The stock market crash served, nonetheless, to precipitate the adjustment with great suddenness at a most unpropitious time. The instinct of farmers who traced their troubles to the stock market was not totally misguided. Finally, when the misfortune had struck, the attitudes of the time kept anything from being done about it. This, perhaps, was the most disconcerting feature of all. Some people were hungry in 1930 and 1931 and 1932. Others were tortured by the fear that they might go hungry. Yet others suffered the agony of the descent from the honor and respectability that goes with income into poverty. And still others feared that they would be next. Meanwhile, everyone suffered from a sense of utter hopelessness. Nothing, it seemed, could be done. And given the ideas which controlled policy, nothing could be done. Had the economy been fundamentally sound in 1929, the effect of the great stock market crash might have been small. Alternatively, the shock to confidence and the loss of spending by those who were caught in the market might soon have worn off. But business in 1929 was not sound. On the contrary, it was exceedingly fragile. It was vulnerable to the kind of blow it received from Wall Street. Those who have emphasized this vulnerability are obviously on strong ground. Yet when a greenhouse succumbs to a hailstorm, something more than a purely passive role is normally attributed to the storm. One must accord similar significance to the typhoon which blew out of Lower Manhattan in October 1929. 7. The military historian, when he has finished his chronicle, is excused. He is not required to consider the chance for a renewal of war with the Indians, the Mexicans, or the Confederacy, nor will anyone press him to say how such acrimony can be prevented. But economics is taken more seriously. The economic historian, as a result, is invariably asked whether the misfortunes he describes will afflict us again, and how they may be prevented. The task of this book, as suggested on an early page, is only to tell what happened in 1929. It is not to tell whether or when the misfortunes of 1929 will recur. One of the pregnant lessons of that year will by now be plain. It is that very specific and personal misfortune awaits those who presume to believe that the future is revealed to them. Yet, without undue risk, it may be possible to gain from our view of this useful year some insights into the future. We can distinguish, in particular, between misfortunes that could happen again and others which events, many of them in the aftermath of 1929, have at least made improbable. And we can perhaps see a little of the form and magnitude of the remaining peril. At first glance, the least probable of the misadventures of the late 20s would seem to be another wild boom in the stock market with its inevitable collapse. As those days of disenchantment drew to a close, tens of thousands of Americans shook their heads and muttered, "Never again." In every considerable community, there are, even now, a few survivors, aged but still chastened, who are still muttering and still shaking their heads. The new era had no such guardians of sound pessimism. Also, there are the new government measures and controls. The powers of the Federal Reserve Board, now styled the Board of Governors, the Federal Reserve System, have been strengthened both in relation to the individual reserve banks and the member banks. Mitchell's defiance of March 1929 is now unthinkable. What was then an act of arrogant but not abnormal individualism would now be regarded as idiotic. The New York Federal Reserve Bank retains a measure of moral authority and autonomy, but not enough to resist any Washington policy. Now also, there is power to set margin requirements. If necessary, the speculator can be made to post the full price of the stock he buys. While this may not completely discourage him, it does mean that when the market falls, there can be no outsurge of margin calls to force further sales and ensure that the liquidation will go through continuing spasms. Finally, the Securities and Exchange Commission is a bar, one hopes effective, to large-scale market manipulation, and it also keeps rein on the devices and the salesmanship by which new speculators are recruited. Yet, in some respects, the chance for recurrence of a speculative orgy remains good. No one can doubt that the American people remain susceptible to the speculative mood, to the conviction that enterprise can be attended by unlimited rewards in which they individually were meant to share. A rising market can still bring the reality of riches. This, in turn, can draw more and more people to participate. The government preventatives and controls are ready. In the hands of a determined government, their efficacy cannot be doubted. There are, however, 100 reasons why a government will determine not to use them. In our democracy, an election is in the offing even on the day after an election. The avoidance of depression and the prevention of unemployment have become, for the politician, the most critical of all questions of public policy. Action to break up a boom must always be weighed against the chance that it will cause unemployment at a politically inopportune moment. Booms, it must be noted, are not stopped until after they have started. And after they have started, the action will always look, as it did to the frightened men in the Federal Reserve Board in February 1929, like a decision in favor of immediate as against ultimate death. As we have seen, the immediate death not only has the disadvantage of being immediate, but of identifying the executioner. The market will not go on a speculative rampage without some rationalization, but during any future boom, some newly rediscovered virtuosity of the free enterprise system will be cited. It will be pointed out that people are justified in paying the present prices, indeed almost any price, to have an equity position in the system. Among the first to accept these rationalizations will be some of those responsible for invoking the controls. They will say firmly that controls are not needed. The newspapers, some of them, will agree and speak harshly of those who think action might be in order. They will be called men of little faith. 8. A new adventure in stock market speculation sometime in the future, followed by another collapse, would not have the same effect on the economy as in 1929. Whether it would show the economy to be fundamentally sound or unsound is something, unfortunately, that will not be wholly evident until after the event. There can be no question, however, that many of the points of extreme weakness exposed in 1929 or soon thereafter have since been substantially strengthened. The distribution of income is no longer quite so lopsided. Between 1929 and 1948, the share of total personal income going to the 5% of the population with the highest income dropped from nearly a third to less than a fifth of the total. Between 1929 and 1950, the share of all family income which was received as wages, salaries, pensions, and unemployment compensation increased from approximately 61% to approximately 71%. This is the income of everyday people. Although dividends, interest, and rent, the income characteristically of the well-to-do, increased in total amount, the share dropped from just over 22 to just over 12% of total family personal income. In ensuing years, the improvement in income distribution tapered off and slightly reversed itself. It remains far better than in the 20s. Similarly, after 1929, the great investment trust promotions were folded up and put away, although eventually they were replaced in part, and alas, by mutual and offshore funds, equity funding, and the real estate investment trusts, which became the casualties of the post-1970 collapse. However, the SEC, aided by the bankruptcy laws, flattened out the great utility holding company pyramids. Federal insurance of bank deposits, even to this day, has not been given full credit for the revolution that it has worked in the nation's banking structure. With this one piece of legislation, the fear which operated so efficiently to transmit weakness was dissolved. As a result, one grievous defect of the old system, by which failure begot failure, was cured. Rarely has so much been accomplished by a single law. The problem of foreign balance is much changed from what it was 25 years ago. Now the United States finds itself with a propensity to buy or spend far more than it sells and receives. Finally, there has been a modest accretion of economic knowledge. A developing depression would not now be met with a fixed determination to make it worse. Without question, ceremonial conferences would be assembled at the White House. We would see an explosion of reassurance and incantation. Many would urge waiting and hoping as the best policy. Not again, however, would people suppose that the best policy would be, as Secretary Mellon so infelicitously phrased it, to liquidate labor, liquidate stocks, liquidate the farmers, liquidate real estate. Our determination to deal firmly and adequately with a serious depression is still to be tested. But there is still a considerable difference between a failure to do enough that is right and a determination to do much that is wrong. Other weaknesses in the economy have been corrected. The much-maligned farm program provides a measure of security for farm income and therewith for spending by farmers. Unemployment compensation accomplishes the same results, if still inadequately, for labor. The remainder of the Social Security system, pensions and public assistance, helps protect the income and consequently the expenditures of yet other segments of the population. The tax system is a far better servant of stability than it was in 1929. An angry God may have endowed capitalism with inherent contradictions, but at least as an afterthought, he was kind enough to make social reform surprisingly consistent with improved operation of the system. 9. Yet all this reinforcement notwithstanding, it would be unwise to expose the economy to the shock of another major speculative collapse. Some of the new reinforcements might buckle. Fissures might open at other new and perhaps unexpected places. Even the quick withdrawal from the economy of the spending that comes from stock market gains might be damaging. Any collapse, even though the further consequences were small, would not be good for the public reputation of Wall Street. Wall Street, in recent times, has become, as a learned phrase has it, very public relations conscious. Since a speculative collapse can only follow a speculative boom, one might expect that Wall Street would lay a heavy hand on any resurgence of speculation. The Federal Reserve would be asked by bankers and brokers to lift margins to the limit. It would be warned to enforce the requirement sternly against those who might try to borrow on their own stocks and bonds in order to buy more of them. The public would be warned sharply and often of the risks inherent in buying stocks for the rise. Those who persisted, nonetheless, would have no one to blame but themselves. The position of the stock exchange, its members, the banks, and the financial community in general would be perfectly clear and as well protected in the event of a further collapse as sound public relations allow. As noted, all this might logically be expected. However, it did not happen in the go-go years of the late 60s and immediately after, the years of the performance funds and the conglomerate explosion, nor will it come to pass. This is not because the instinct for self-preservation in Wall Street is poorly developed. On the contrary, it is probably normal and may be above. But now, as throughout history, financial capacity and political perspicacity are inversely correlated. Long-run salvation by men of business has never been highly regarded, if it means disturbance of orderly life and convenience in the present. So inaction will be advocated in the present, even though it means deep trouble in the future. Here, at least equally with communism, lies the threat to capitalism. It is what causes men who know that things are going quite wrong to say that things are fundamentally sound.